In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front axle shift fork, which is what actually engages both of your CV axles once you shift into four-wheel drive on this Ford F-150. Let's get started. Now with a 12-point 12mm socket, you're going to want to remove the CV shaft or the half shaft bolts that hold it on to the front axle tube. There are several of them. Just go around and the wheel should spin freely, so just turn it as needed and remove them. They are pretty tight, keep that in mind. Spin the wheel and move on to the next one. With a 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts and then remove the wheel. Let's remove the tie rod from the knuckle so we can spin it in either direction freely. And to do that, I'm going to get this cotter pin off of here. There we go, discard that, don't reuse these. And then take your 21mm socket and remove the castle nut. Then take a hammer, tap the knuckle, and the tie rod should pop right out. There we go. Take this out, now we can spin the knuckle. Now let's pop the upper ball joint out of the knuckle. So remove the cotter pin, and then we'll take our socket and remove the castle nut. There we go, discard this one as well. Take a 22mm socket and remove this nut. You'll most likely need a swivel adapter for this. There we go. And I actually like to put it back just a couple threads so that once I break this free, it doesn't come flying up and the knuckle flying forward. Tap it with a hammer right here. Perfect. And I actually like to put it back just a couple threads so that once I break this free, it doesn't come flying up and the knuckle flying forward. Tap it with a hammer right here. Perfect. Before we completely remove this ball joint, let's break the axle nut free so we can free up the axle. So let's remove the cotter pin for the axle nut. Take that off, remove this, and use a 36mm socket and remove this axle nut. There we go. At this point, you want to make sure that it pushes through. You don't want it to be seized inside the hub, so I'm going to put the axle nut back on flush with the end so that I don't damage the threads, and then tap it with a hammer. That's perfect, breaks free right away, so that's good. We can take this off, and we are clear to remove the upper ball joint now and get our axle out. Use a pry bar, pry on the shock tower and down on the ball joint. You can see it puts it back into the knuckle, but this is so that we can remove this mounting nut. And once you take this off of here, make sure you go slow so that this doesn't come flying up and this going sideways. As you can see, we still have things connected. I'm going to pop the ABS wire out of the retainers here for the brake hose. That gives us a little more slack. The brake hose should have enough in it. And now we can push the axle through. Okay, push the axle towards the back. You're gonna have to grab it from underneath, slide it up and over the sway bar link and down. All right, now with the axle out, let's put the upper ball joint back into the knuckle, and this will just hold it there in place while we do the rest of the job. I'm gonna put this mounting nut on a few threads so it can be somewhat secured, and this will ensure that everything stays where it needs to be. It doesn't pull on any wires or the brake hose or anything like that. And there we go. Now let's move to the front here underneath and take off this cover that covers the actuator. So there are 3 10mm bolts they have to remove. The third one is a little sneaky. It's right up at the top, but you can fit a wrench in there. Not sure that you can actually fit a ratchet or anything like that, but a wrench will definitely fit. Take that out. They're not very long. Now the cover should be able to slide right out. To remove this, you want to peel this boot back, or forward, I guess, and then there's a little C-clip that you can usually pry out with a pocket screwdriver or a pick or whatever you have. Sometimes they're a little stuck, so if yours is, spray some rust penetrant. And same for this. A lot of times this actuator will seize inside of this aluminum bracket. In my case, it's not, so that's great. And once you can remove that, you should just be able to pull it straight out. The boot will come off, and this you can just leave hanging over here. Or you can unplug it and set it aside. Let's remove this hose. This is just a breather hose for the front differential. Wiggle it, try not to break it. If you do break it, make sure you replace it. This needs to be sealed up and covered. Before we move any further, let's drain the front differential. You can use a 3/8 ratchet on the drain plug at the bottom here. Break it free. Pull the plug out and let it drain into a collection bucket. Now let's take these 4 bolts off. They're all 15mm in size. If yours has this tag still, you keep it and then obviously put it back on when the time comes. Now let's remove the last bolt holding this on, so be careful, but this is a 15mm headed bolt that goes through the frame here, right underneath the engine mount, and this is an 18mm nut, which you can take off either side, but I prefer to hold the nut and remove the bolt because if for some reason it's kind of stuck in there, this will also break the bolt free. There we go. That worked. Remove the nut. As you can see, the bolt spins freely. That's perfect. Sometimes it gets stuck in there. Remove that. Now you should be able to pull this down, but it's not going to do anything because it's still stuck here with probably RTV or a gasket or something. Grab onto this part of the differential tube and with a rubber mallet, gently tap this so you can break it free. It's most likely stuck here just from it being on there for a long time with the gasket and some sealant. There we go. I'm going to put a pull jack right where the CV axle mounts here so that I can raise this side of the differential up while the other side gets lowered to get the right angle for removal. So let's get this fork out of here, take a punch, and we're going to have to punch this pin straight through the backside. It has an opening there, but it's just a divot, so it can't go anywhere into the differential. All right, looks like I went all the way through with it, and yep, sure enough, it can move, so that means it's free. And now we can pull this out. It's going to have an O-ring on it. We're going to have to replace that. You can barely see it because of all this nasty oil that's in here, but Now we can pull the fork out. There's our broken fork, and on the back side you can see the pin. That can stay with it. Of course, we have a new one. I don't recommend reusing these. A lot of times these also break, so this can also be a failure point. But there you have it. Now let's do some cleaning and time for reinstallation. I'm going to take a rag and wipe off any other debris that might be in here. Try to get as much of the old oil out, because most likely if your fork had those pads that were damaged, well, there could be debris sitting down here. And if you can, you want to get it out. Now, it is plastic, so if it gets inside to the differential, the gears, yeah, sure, you can pop the cover off and take it all out, but in the end, it's plastic, it'll be all right. So next, I want to take a razor blade and gently remove all of this gasket maker that's on here so that we can apply new stuff and have it seal up properly. You don't want an oil leak here. You'll have to do the job all over again if that's the case. Now we have to clean up the surface on this part of the differential tube. I'm actually going to remove this stub shaft here with the collar. This is the collar that fork actuates. I'm going to remove this just so it doesn't dangle here and potentially fall off. Make sure that you either leave this washer on here, this thrust washer, or you take it out and set it aside safely, because this has to be in here. So because it's kind of stuck here from the oils, I'm just going to leave it be. I'm going to remove the rest of the components, and then usually there is a rubber gasket in here, but it looks like someone's already been in here and put some silicone, some RTV. So I'm going to use a pocket screwdriver and some picks and just scrape all this off. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to kind of restore this groove so that we can add new silicone and seal this up properly. Otherwise you'll have an oil leak. And like I said, it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. We will use brake parts cleaner to degrease it at the end so that it can stick. So just try to scrape this all out of here. Clean this off with some brake parts cleaner, especially right in this groove. Next we have to replace the O-ring that's on this shaft that moves the fork. You can use a pick and, oops, get the old one off of here. It's a little bit of a snug fit. If you can hold it and run the pick around, there we go. That'll get it out of its spot. Remove this and discard it. Now I want to clean up this area because, as you can see, there's some debris in here, and I want the new O-ring to be able to seal up properly. Otherwise, oil will actually leak out past it and through the side of the differential where this goes in. So make sure this is nice and clean in here. Scrape it off. Spray this with a little bit of brake parts cleaner if needed to get everything off of here. Wipe it off with a clean rag. And now take the new O-ring. You can lubricate it with oil if you want. I already have some oil on my gloves, so that helps. And that will allow it to slide on a lot easier. Get it all the way over here onto or into its groove. Perfect. And this is ready for installation now. So to reinstall this, we actually have to take this stub shaft that we removed earlier when cleaning, slide that in, just like so, and then the fork needs to actually slide on the collar before it gets reinstalled. And the way the collar goes is it's going to have a tapered side and a narrower flat side. The flat side goes towards the rest of the axle tube. You can also see that the splines are tapered on this side so that when it slides over and engages, it doesn't have a straight edge like it does on this side. So slide this in. You're going to have to find the right splines. And I did apply gear oil to all of this so that it goes in pre-lubricated. Now don't forget there was a washer here. We're going to have to add that in, but I'm going to leave it off for now so it doesn't keep falling off. So at this point, let's add the arm in with the new O-ring. Make sure it goes through the fork, maneuver it as needed. And then we're going to want to line up the pin hole in the arm and in the fork. It'll be somewhat difficult to see, but I can just barely see it line up right there. Another way to line it up is to move it around while you're trying to put the pin in. And the pin has an area on one end where it's narrower that has to go in first. And the only reason that is so that you can actually start it in without it falling off. Now you can take your hammer, tap this in gently. Use a punch that's larger than the pin so you don't damage it. It presses even on the entire surface. It keeps wanting to slide. And although you can't see the other side, the pin is significantly longer than it needs to be, and that is like that on purpose, so that you can get it close, and it's most likely sticking just as far out the other side, if not a little bit more. So that's perfect. The arm or the fork is installed, and as you can see, it's actuating properly as it should, so that's great. Now on the part that we removed, let's add this thrust washer back in. I put some oil on it. Putting oil on it ensures that it kind of sticks to this gear here and it won't fall off. The oil will basically suction itself here. And now I cleaned this very well with brake parts cleaner, so there's no oil on either this surface or the one that it's mounting up against. And we're going to use some gasket maker, and that's a little much right there. You just want a thin layer going around here. That's what's going to seal it all up. Don't fill this groove all the way. Don't lather it on this entire surface. Just a thin layer, and the groove is there to basically accept the extra gasket maker. Try to have a consistent bead all the way around, and then with a clean glove, if necessary, you can even it out. Make sure it has the same amount all around. And now take this part, slide it in, make sure it lines up. At this point, I'm going to lower the support I had on the other side so this part of the axle tube can go up, and I'm going to mount it up here so it can stay secured in place. There we go. Just going to slide that bolt through. Let's put these 4 bolts in. Thread them in by hand. This is an aluminum housing, so if you cross thread it, it's very easy to damage the threads. This one with the tag, I'm going to put back right where I got it from. If you want to put it in a different spot, that's fine, but keep in mind, if you put it up here, it'll be closer to the oil pan, so if an oil pan gasket is needed, well, the tag might be in the way. So once you get all 4 of these back, let's bottom them out. I'm going to go in a cross pattern so that this entire unit can seal itself perfectly even. If I just do 2 at the bottom or 2 at the top or one side, it has the possibility of going in crooked. When it comes to this tag, I'm going to try and aim it upwards a little so that it's not hanging down, potentially getting caught and ripped off. There we go. And last bolt. Whoa. All right, now we'll come back and torque it. 54 foot-pounds is the torque for all these. I'm also going to torque them in a cross pattern for the same exact reason. Doesn't matter where you start, as long as you go across. And you can double check them if you want, but there you have it, they're torqued. Let's reconnect the breather hose up top here. Make sure that's sealed up. Once again, if water makes its way in here, then you'll have issues with the gear oil that you put inside the differential. And then take the actuator and let's slide this in. And it's a good idea to put some grease on this or anti-seize, because a lot of times this surface right here will seize inside the aluminum. So I'm going to do just that. At this point, you can remove your support. It is no longer needed. I'm going to apply some silicone paste. That's just what I had on hand, but Like I said, any sort of grease or anti-seize will do the job. Slide this through. Now, as you slide it, this arm needs to be in the, well, disengaged position is what that is, and this needs to be pushed out all the way. As you slide this through, before you hook it onto the arm, we need to put the boot on. Make sure that slides over. Now you can slide this through, but at the same time, pull the arm backwards and resecure it on here, just like this. So this needs to be engaged. Make sure this slides through all the way so that you can see the groove where this little clip needs to lock everything in. You can push it down with a screwdriver. There we go. All right. That's locked in all the way. The actuator is bottomed out and the clip is locking everything in, and the arm is properly secured. It's important that it's sitting in this notch, otherwise it won't really do anything if this is not operating anything. Let's put the shield back in. You're gonna have to guide it in place at the top here. It's gonna get stuck, but it's plastic and it's soft, so you can maneuver it into place. Start in all 3 of the mounting bolts. Doesn't matter which one you start with, but I like to leave them loose until all of them are in so that this can move around. That way you can line them all up. And last one is all the way up here. So I can do it by hand first. Just make sure they're nice and snug. All right. Put the mounting nut back onto the bolt that goes through the differential here, or the bracket to support the differential. I'm going to use my socket on the bolt side, 15mm, just like we did for removal. And then I'm going to hold this with my wrench. I'm going to snug it up, and then the torque for this is 66 foot-pounds. Let's torque it. I'm going to torque the nut side because it gives you a more accurate torque spec. So we'll get an 18mm socket. Hold the head of the bolt if necessary. Sometimes the entire thing will spin in here. In my case, it was good. It stayed, so let's move on. Reinstall the drain plug on the differential. When tightening this, you don't need to really crank it down. As soon as it bottoms out, which is right here, give it a little extra, and that's good. You don't need to completely crush it. The torque for this is 18 foot-pounds, and the same will actually apply to the fill plug after we fill it. That's it. Now let's get the fill plug out. Use that same 3/8 drive ratchet. Get it in here, break this free, remove the fill plug all the way. Now let's fill the differential with 80/90 gear oil. This takes about 1.8 quarts. So just a little under 2. And because of the location of this fill plug, you're going to want to use a fluid transfer pump unless you have something else that'll get in here. And you're going to want to fill it until it starts coming out, or you can measure out 1.8 quarts. Oh, there we go. It's starting to leak out. So that's how we know it's full. For us, it took just about 2 quarts because we had it open. You don't have to wait for this to stop draining. You can just cap it off. Wipe off the excess with a rag so it doesn't drip on you or anywhere else. And 18 foot-pounds is the torque for this, just like for the drain plug. That's it right there. Now before we get the CV axle in, I like to clean up this mating surface here. It's in pretty good shape. It's not rusty, it's not pitted, but there are some spots here that I'd like to hit with the wire brush, so I will, or the wire wheel. But you want to do the same thing to the axle side, and of course if yours is in perfect condition then don't bother, but mine, as you can see, has a couple spots that it could use some cleaning. wipe it off. And we're going to apply a little bit of either grease or anti-seize. I'm just going to go for grease because that's what I have on hand. But you can put anti-seize on this surface, and that's going to prevent rust from building up between this surface and the axle shaft, and it will prevent it from being stuck in the future. I'm choosing to apply some grease, but like I said, anti-seize is also fine, whatever you have. Now get your pry bar, pry this down, and let's pop the upper ball joint out of the knuckle again if you put it back. There we go. Get the axle back in. Put it up and over the sway bar link. Now line it up with the differential side. Before I put it into the knuckle, I need to get some of these bolts in so it'll stay. I cleaned up the old thread locker and I put new thread locker on the bolts. It's important to do this with anything that spins and rotates, vibrates. There we go. All right. So with at least one in, you should be able to let go and it'll stay. And the more you put in, the more secure it'll be. Now I'm going to tighten these up in a cross pattern. That way the axle can seat itself properly. And now we can come back and torque them. Now to torque these, you're going to want to use your 12-point 12mm socket and a pry bar to put right between these bolts to prevent this from spinning. 60 foot-pounds is the torque for these. You can either mark them or just remember which ones you torqued. Also, it's a good idea to go in a cross pattern. There we go, they're all torqued. Before we put the axle into the hub, I like to put some grease or anti-seize on these splines. That way it doesn't get stuck in the future, and next time it needs to be removed, you don't have to hammer it out. You should be able to just push it out. You don't need a lot, just a thin layer to coat it. That's it. Now, let's put the axle back into the knuckle. And now, you might need to spin it a little bit so the splines can line up. Once they do, you should be able to push the knuckle up, and we'll put the upper ball joint through the knuckle. Use your pry bar and push this down. Put the mounting nut on so it can be supported on here properly. Now you can let go. Use your 22mm socket, tighten this up, and the torque for it is 66 foot-pounds. Now it is torqued, but if the cotter pin slot does not line up with the cutout on the castle nut, you have to keep tightening and never loosen to make them line up. For me, it does line up, and always use a new cotter pin. Slide it through and bend it over to lock it in. we go. Sometimes if you let it wiggle a little bit like this, it prevents it from seizing in there. Next, let's put the ABS wire back on the brake hose, reattach this, snap it into the 2 retainers. Okay, let's put the tie rod back, put the nut back on, tighten this up. 76 foot-pounds for this nut. At this point, we need to line up the cotter pin slot. Looks like for me, I have to go just a little bit more. You always want to go more, not loosen. And now, take a new cotter pin, slide it through, and of course, bend it over to lock it in. Let's put the axle nut back on. The torque for this, after we bottom it out, is 221 foot-pounds. Use a pry bar between the lug studs. Make sure it's flat, not at an angle. If it's at an angle, it'll damage the threads. And now you can torque the axle nut. That's it. Get this back on, spin it to line it up with whatever slot it needs to, so the cotter pin can go through, and take the cotter pin, bend it over to lock it in. Let's get the wheel back on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them in a cross pattern to 150 foot-pounds. 150 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them if you want. Now with everything back together, take it for a road test, but if you test your 4-wheel drive, make sure it is on gravel, snow, dirt, mud, just not dry pavement. After finishing this repair, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.